Welcome to the Jordan School District Suicide Prevention Training. For this topic of this section, it will be about the language of suicide. So first off, what we're going to start off with is what we say matters to people. How do we do it? How do we recognize what we say matters to other people? The first thing that we have to recognize when we're going to talk to somebody who may be suicidal is we have to first recognize what is the person that we are trying to talk to? Who are they? We need to be able to understand who they are and be able to use different verbiage based off of who they are. Mainly we have to focus on age, sex, race, level of education, cultural and ethnical backgrounds. So for example, when we talk about this, we will be, you first have to recognize, again, who your audience is. If we're going to be talking to a elementary school kid based on, or compared to a high school student, it's going to be a different way that we address the situation. For example, with the elementary age child, it's probably going to be a little bit more softer. We're going to say things with a little more understanding and try to come down to their age a little bit, be a little bit more aware of that they may not recognize either their emotions as well as a high school student, or just in general how to even recognize a lot of their emotions. Now when it comes down to cultural and ethnical backgrounds, this also plays a major role in how we talk to that person. For example, based off of a culture of somebody, they may have different beliefs about suicide, and we have to recognize that and how they may perceive that. For example, there's a drastic difference between the way that many people in the Asian culture see suicide as to the Western culture. And it's important to recognize what that difference is and be able to ask that person what is their belief and be able to work around what their belief is. The second point here is being confident and open with those who are suicidal. It is at times a myth that we cannot help, that we cannot, if we talk to somebody who is suicidal, we talk to them about suicide, it's going to actually increase the chances of them being suicidal. This is actually a myth, like I said earlier. The fact is that if we talk to somebody and we're open and confident with that person, chances are we can actually lead them away from being suicidal and acting and not acting on their suicidal thoughts. When we talk to others, and the reason why this matters, is what we say matters, is we need to be able to stay away from negative and judgmental comments about suicide, about what the suicidal person is feeling. If we can do this, they can feel open and be able to share more with us. When we're talking to people, and how we do this is we also focus on the hope for the future and why they should live, of why they are worth and what they mean to us as a person. As we continue on focusing on what we say matters to people, we have to start recognizing the way that we talk about suicide will shape the way that we start to think about suicide. If you look at the list here, there's ways there's terms of what to avoid and phrases you could say that be more respectful. As you can see that are on the right, a couple of things that it says is we try to avoid things like saying successful suicide, or someone committed suicide, or so-and-so is suicidal. Instead, we like to try to use different phrases such as died by suicide, or instead of committed suicide, died by suicide, or took their own life. There's reasons why we do this, and a lot of those we're trying to stay away from a bias and still trying to be respectful for the person who did pass away. Such as for the committed suicide, why we try this is we don't want, sometimes it seems as though we're trying to imply that the person either made a crime or they committed a sin. Although this may be in some people's views and mindsets, we still have to be respectful for that person who did pass away. And so it's important that we start to focus on the most respectful phrases that we can use. Another one that I like to point out here too is where it talks about Sally is suicidal. Sometimes when we talk about with being somebody suicidal, we create our stigma in our own by saying that this person is that type of thought. That's how we can summarize that person. But when we say somebody is suicidal, we have to recognize there's more to that person than just their thoughts. We also are more than just our own thoughts. So when we talk about someone who has had suicidal thoughts, we do that. We say, so-and-so has had suicidal thoughts. Again, recognizing that those thoughts may not make up the person. They just are an aspect of that person, of that time, that they are having thoughts. Lastly here, we need to understand what leads to suicide. A lot of times it seems like it's confusing to us of why someone decides to get to the point of suicide, or what leads them to that point. We have to recognize that suicide is nothing about a mental failing or something wrong with that person, or as if they're doing something wrong. But there's multiple variables that lead to somebody wanting to kill themselves eventually, or act through with a suicide. For example, biological factors, psychological factors, and past history combined together with current life events usually lead to a risk, and what can eventually lead to a suicide attempt. It's important to recognize that these four factors usually are playing a role with each other to lead the person to where they're at now. Although sometimes it may seem like an impulsive act that somebody does, it is usually something that is building up over time that they may not even recognize in their own life. It's important that we need to be sensitive to that and be able to recognize how we can help them and understand that. This ends the first section here. The next section we will continue to talk about how to talk to somebody who is suicidal.